As I was explaining to some colleagues during lunch time, Canada reminds me of the European Union in the sense that every province has its laws, health and civil rights, law and so on is largely provincial. The federal government intervenes at a higher level in terms of drugs and safety and devices and so on, and criminal law. So we're very much a heterogeneous, small little model of the difficulties, and yet at the same time we can look at the positive side, the creativity that can come from different approaches across Canada and thus across Europe. So I've been asked to look at emerging issues, and hopefully there'll be more than the ones that I will present to you. But as was mentioned in the introduction, in 2009, myself and a number of scholars in different fields, sociology, law, philosophy, history of science, and so on, published a book on pediatric research ethics in Canada. It was a background book, and we were subsequently funded to do a best practices, not a typical professorial monograph, but actually how would the issues that we raised in our book translate into practical discussion points or points to consider or practices for research ethics boards in Canada. And the unique part, I think, about this was that in the discussion part, we relied very heavily on documents coming from international organizations and from European and other countries where we could find them in about 4 or 5 languages, so as to broaden the context in which pediatric ethics boards would discuss substantive issues. We thought it was very important that if another country had guidance on an issue, that research ethics boards in Canada should be aware. There's a XX at the bottom of the slide for December. It's in translation right now, and hopefully before Christmas, Deo Volente, we will have this document out in French and English for discussion purposes. It complements what in Canada we call the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which is the ethics guidance for research boards or committees, whatever, IRBs as you call them in the States. And in that sense, it's not of the same normative hierarchy, but it's meant there to complement the Tri-Council Policy Statement. So as you can tell from the table of contents, it covers the traditional areas that are of concern and that ethics committees have to deal with. There's nothing innovative in terms of the actual outline of the issues to be discussed. Now, my outline is going to take you through some old classical issues that are being rediscussed. So they were old, but they're coming back. And then the second half of my presentation will look at emerging issues per se. When I was looking then on the issue of inclusion, which of course is very much part of the whole change in both in Europe and the United States, the obligation then to include children in clinical trials, I went to look for different discussions on risks and benefits. And in a recent statement from the Canadian Pediatric Society, their group on drug therapy and hazardous substances, in an article published in 2011 in Pediatric Child Health, it amazed me that such a recent discussion would still bring up the point that as much as 75% of relatively recent product monographs still provide no data on dosing or safe use in children. So now, if you look at that statistic in 2011, you say, is the risks of the trials, or the risk to children is the risk of not doing pediatric research? And I think we've in this balancing of risks and benefits, the obligation to include them and to facilitate good science, to ethically facilitate good science involving children, I think should be part of that balancing of risks and benefits, and not just the particular drug or device in question. In the old classical, the consent to research versus care the blurring, if you like, between these two fields and questions about age, about competence and Ascent. It's very clear from a legal point of view, at least, that the legal age for research in most countries may not be the same as that for access to care. But that's not what I wanted to describe with this slide. My concern here is that as we move to different kinds of trials that will do genotyping of children as a safety issue before their inclusion or exclusion from clinical trials. So to avoid mortality, morbidity in phase 1, they will probably do genotyping not only for safety reasons, but also for responder, non-responder, and so narrow down their group that they wish to include. The problem with genotyping as an inclusion-exclusion criterion for clinical trials is that you see a lot more in terms of genes and what they may or may not mean for children than you actually might wish to know. And I'll come back to this particular issue in my second part on what's happening in emerging issues. So in the minds of parents then, having genotyping is a safety issue. In the same time, they think that they're going to get therapeutic benefit in finding out if their child is at genetic risk for something else. And that way, you end up with a conflation between the research and the clinical settings, which can lead to not an inducement to participate, but could certainly influence their understanding of the trial and the risks. Another one that we brought up this morning was the issue of Ascent. And I think here, having drafted Ascent templates, I'm increasingly, I have to use the word disturbed. What did I do? Oh, disturbed, so that went off, by the fact that Ascent seems to be becoming very much a pro forma, simplified template in pardon my expression, in baby language, so as to make sure that the child is involved. And yet, for Ascent to be meaningful, you would have to, at a minimum, have a child capable of understanding the nature of the trial. Consent is not only the nature of the trial, it's the risks, the benefits, the future consequences, alternatives, and so on. It's a higher level. But at a minimum, you should not be asking for Ascent for children who cannot at least understand the nature of the research in question. And so when I see Ascent forms being used for 5-year-olds, I mean, who haven't even begun school and who obviously it's read to them, or when you think that even for criminal liability, a child who has not achieved the age of reason cannot be liable because they can't understand the nature of their acts, how can they be assenting? So I think this is something that we have to, at a minimum, say a child capable of understanding then can assent or dissent. Second to last on the old but not so old is that of confidentiality. And in particular with the increased interest in longitudinal studies. You'll see some classical longitudinal studies, particularly in the UK, which has a very good history of birth cohorts, the 1958 birth cohort, or the Avon longitudinal, the ALSPEC study, and so on. An interest in following children developmentally over time, and that way being able to trace from prenatal all the way to the age of maturity or legal age, the effects of environment and gene-gene interaction and so on. But with longitudinal studies then, the right of withdrawal becomes an issue in these, because the child will not necessarily know till later that they are in there, and how do they withdraw, and how do we make sure that when they do reach the legal age, they are asked for their own consent to continue participating. So while we should allow for the broad consent that these epidemiological studies mandate, i.e. to participate with samples and data over time for future unspecified research, it has to be matched with an increased level of data security, withdrawal mechanisms, and heightened governance. So that's the trade-off that comes with the privacy risks of long-term involvement in pediatric longitudinal studies. And finally, on the old but classical, is the difficulty from a researcher point of view of conflicting messages. And I think we started our discussion before lunch about something that we needed to do here. I myself was a principal investigator because they needed a social scientist. I don't think in a population genetics study, I'm not even a population geneticist or a geneticist, of a long-term 50-year cohort of adults between age 40 and 69, presumably asymptomatic, randomly selected, so not chosen for any disease, so presumably healthy and competent. I went to 18 ethics committees for a 3-year project. The ethics itself took 20 months. And as you know, with the money in government and so on, it has to be spent by a certain date. It was from someone who works in the field, who's been training both lawyers and bioethicists for years, being there myself in front of ethics committees where my own students were often sitting in the up in the on the front there. I realized then that what we really need is more transparency. We need a jurisprudence, as we say in French. We need to know not who's doing what. We need to know the rationale behind the decisions that we can accept no matter which way they go, but at least we have, for training purposes, a link to real life with real decisions and a possibility of discussion and appeal. So in my current pediatric trial that I'm involved in, we prepared a template, and again, some of the core elements that we said, this is core. If this is not accepted by an ethics committee, this researcher cannot be in, because this is the nature of the trial, that this be core. And core had to do with collaboration and sharing and access to samples and data within the project. Core was access to samples and data by outside researchers outside of the country, because it's a rare disease. So for rare diseases, we need people with rare diseases from everywhere to get some sort of statistical significance and so on. And even core elements such as that, in some cases, were not accepted due to hypothetical risks of hypothetical re-identifiability or hypothetical abuses that obviously you cannot counter in terms of with any kind of evidence. So having a jurisprudence, having sort of a case anonymized, but materials, if I would have known, for instance, about the Duchenne in the Netherlands, maybe I could have seen some of their reasoning and taken it to the ethics committee and so on. And I think internationally we need to do a lot more of this kind of sharing between ethics committees and what's their discussions are. So what are the emerging ethical issues? Well, the one that I have seen in every protocol going forward since about January of 2011 is the return of research results. And I've seen it in 3 different domains, 3 different areas. One is a democratization, if you like, partly influenced in North America by the direct-to-consumer approach, i.e. patients and patient advocacy groups saying, you know, we know our stuff, we want to send it into these companies, we're going to get information back, we can understand it, we'll control it, we will control our destinies. And this whole notion of a greater consensualism, if you like, between the patient research participant and the clinician/researcher. So it's with the return of results per se, there's no difficulty with understanding where they're coming from. The problem is that research is not, it's about generalizable knowledge. It's not about individual patients or research participants. And so that spillover from the direct-to-consumer movement is hard to fit into the research domain where you're not looking for individual results. You're looking, you might not even know what you're looking for, or you might not find what you're looking for, and you may never have results. though, as I'll say later, the fact that you may never have results is probably just as important to communicate. The second influence on this return to results debate is that coming from the emergence in the last decade of population biobanks at a very large scale. Now, these biobanks are not research per se. They are resources or infrastructures that will help disease-based or clinical trials to then use them as controls, as validators, for comparison purposes, and so on. So they're not built to benefit anyone. They are definitely the kind of biobanks that you build for future generations and knowledge that will help future disease studies that you don't know yet. And in those population studies, there's definitely a no returns policy. And people in those no return population biobanks are aware that they are coming in as citizens. They're not coming in as in a research protocol per se, or they're not coming in as patients. So this is changing the whole attitude of how to understand from an ethics point of view when your ethics guidelines in your country talk about autonomy and direct or indirect benefit. How indirect is it when it's benefits for future diseases or future generations? So there's a no returns policy in contrast to the direct to consumer. But the one that has the most influence right now on all protocols in pediatrics that I've seen is whole genome, whole exome sequencing, what they call next generation sequencing. And as the cost of this goes down in the pediatric area, now I'll get to the implications for pediatrics, this has made the question of what results, which, when, to whom, absolutely a very controversial issue in almost every country where researchers are beginning to use this new technology. So I'll come back to the pediatric specific aspects in a minute. So just before then we look at this pediatric specific and return of results, you have to remember the contextual framework in which this issue should be discussed. One, the very particular nature of the relationship of children and minors involved in research. The best interest of the child, especially in this one, and you'll see in my conclusion why the International Convention of the Child that actually says that the best interests are primary, that the best interests are paramount, can be used to override parental authorization. And I'll come back to that. Respect for persons, what do you do when you see more incidental findings than you see actually what you're looking for? What's the clinical significance? Most researchers that I know that are fundamental researchers are not necessarily clinicians. It might not know that what they're looking at, what they think it might be diabetes, even though they're researchers on cardio, might not understand it, might not know even if you can do something about it, i.e. actionable. If there are any results to be communicated, who's going to do it, when, for how long? What if you sit on this whole genome or your whole exome and you have no results today, but 5 years from now it means something? What are your obligations? The familial context for at-risk relatives, and then obviously the evolving capacity of the child. So, did a research on return of results, international, regional, and national, 42 countries, and looking for guidance. And this is where we ended up, in the Tower of Babel, and with the conclusion that there is now a conflation between research findings and incidental findings. So incidental findings then are those that are discovered during research but that are outside your original scope. So you weren't looking for them, but there they are staring you in the face. So what do you do now? Do we even continue to have a distinction between incidental and research if, unless you use filters, i.e. you tell the lab, don't send me anything other than what I'm looking for. Like my researchers in diabetes, only send me results to do with diabetes. So you avoid the incidental findings that come with whole genome, whole exome. Or you use an algorithm. You develop statistically a way of filtering out the results that have nothing to do with your research so you don't get stuck with the incidental findings. Also looked in those documents, what does clinical utility mean? Even if it's scientifically validated in another lab, the criterion, the second one, is it has to be scientifically valid and clinically have clinical utility. Now, if this is unreadable to you, the range here in some of the documents, information that is relevant to their welfare. That's really broad. Another one, information vital to a subject's life. That's the other extreme. That's life-saving. Information pertinent to the improvement of health. That's open-ended. Clinically actionable. So they mix up actionability with utility. Something might not lead to a cure, but could help better understand or make choices for the future. So here again, we have absolutely a mishmash of interpretations on clinical utility. So what are some of the norms that we found? Well, first of all, you have to register. And I think in registering already as a first sign of systematically addressing the issue of return of results, because obviously over time, and some trials being time limited and so on, you not only avoid unnecessary duplication, but you can actually contact researchers doing similar research around in your own country or around the world. Secondly, irrespective of my comment about overriding parents, the rule is above and first most to respect at the prima facie parental authorization in the determination of the best interests of the child. Now, obviously in genetics there's familial and all kinds of complications. I'm not going to go into genetics today, but this reminder of parents of legal and often social, cultural, and religious authority is something we have to keep in mind under, of course, the best interests of the child test. And here, in health decisions, contrary to freedom of religion or contrary to social values or the way children dress or where they play or who their friends are. In health, however, there is this paramount interest that their best interest of children is to maintain and improve their health. Again, looking at different norms, here what's interesting is that individual research results themselves will vary with understanding of the particular disorder. So within the notion of research results, there's a great variability, and not all research results, as we know, are reliable or valid, and they have to go through several different steps before they are really meaningful. So this is the danger of what we call therapeutic misconception, when parents will enroll their children thinking they're going to find out something beneficial for the child or for other family members. So there has to be some caution taken with respect to enrollment and the promise of understanding of particular conditions. So having done the norms from various countries, went to look at consent forms themselves. And here, my consent forms are Canadian, but you can decide for yourself whether you've seen them or reflects what you see in your country. Now, the position for research has been you will not get reports because the value of research for any individual as a person with their own contextual and familial history is often not known. And that's the whole purpose of research. So you will not receive any reports or information because we don't know the importance for any particular individual. I think that's very honest. People can accept it. That's research. You're not in one particular field or trying a particular drug or device. Consequently, it would be impossible to inform you or your child, but you will have general results. And whereas when you're dealing with drugs and devices, there often are very many individual results because you are actually testing on an individual child in relation to their particular susceptibility or resistance or transmission or whatever. you will have individual results. But most research is general. I think we're lacking imagination for the communication of general results. I think we're jumping into the individual results bandwagon without having thought of creative ways of communicating general results. Don't tell people to go read it in a medical journal. I think that's for the GPs to do. For the public, this is, I think, where we really need to put some serious effort. Now, incidental findings. If we find something other than what we're looking for, and I think the whole neuroimaging is another field where this applies, and it's life-threatening or very serious, and there's treatment available, we will recontact you unless you say no. For all other information that may be uncovered, we will not recontact you. So what we now see for adults right now, for adults, is, even if it's a children's hospital, this is most studies now have trios of children, parents, and unaffected relatives. For the adults, you have a choice. You want to know, you don't want to know. You want to help your family, but leave me alone. You'll just tick off the box, don't want to know. Otherwise, you will be recontacted if you said yes. But other chance information, we will not contact you. And this is a problem because ethics committees say, well, what if you see something that's really important? Well, that's why you give adults this option to know or not to know. But, and this is the pediatric rare diseases study that I'm involved in, if there is a chance that we find something we're not looking for, which could impact the care of you or your child during childhood, note it says during childhood. So no late onset stuff works here, no Alzheimer, no Huntington's disease, and so on. Something that affects the child up to the age of majority. Then we will inform you whether the parent wants to or not. And this is where the ethical discussion came in terms of the rights of the asymptomatic child at risk to be found and to be treated in their best interests. And the ethics committee in this particular project considered it to be child neglect. If something could medically be done to help the child and improve their health during childhood, and the parents would exercise their option not to know. So to be in this project, there is no option for parents to refuse such information. So in conclusion, what is this hot and heavy discussion on return of results? And believe me, this gets really more complicated as some individuals wish to expand it to personal utility, they wish to expand it to reproductive benefit, and so on and so on. In the meantime, research is becoming increasingly international through various consortia. And so you have InterHeart, or you have the International Cancer Genome, or you have Pediatric International. There are pediatric studies in here, and you're handling on a meta level a very eclectic response by different national countries to the issue of return of results. The line that it says right now in the International Cancer Genome is that return of results will be determined by national legislation. You wash your hands and so on. So that was fine till they started including pediatric cohorts inside this consortium. So now we're revisiting the policies and ethics and procedures of this consortium. Similarly, at the same time, the Public Population Project in Genomics and Society has been harmonizing population biobanks for the last 8 years to make sure that they're interoperable so that the same kind of gene environment data can be shared to achieve statistical significance in a much shorter time. This population project just published a study showing that in 53 studies who used the core questionnaire and the core measurements, the core variables, the core consent forms, on any given variable, 223 of them, you could create 6 million virtual participants. So again, it's a new way of doing science. It's what's called infrastructure science, where there are no individual results, but again, there's going to be a pediatric platform built inside this Public Population Project in Genomics. And again, how will we harmonize? How will we make it interoperable? Doesn't mean standardize. How will we allow them pediatric to talk to each other? particularly now with the interest in the EU and the NIH and in Canada and other countries for an international rare diseases consortium, where of course pediatric is very looms large simply because of the number of conditions found in children. So my last slide then is to have, I think this afternoon in tomorrow's discussion, I think we need to start sort of thinking outside the cube. This is a slide that comes from physics and systems biology, where they work on epigenetic and networking approaches to knowledge, and where different diseases are under, I don't know if you've heard of Bartha, who works on the diseaseome, and if diseases are connected, and obviously children become adults and so on, that we have to think not only internationally or Europe-wise or Canada-wise, but also in ethics to go outside of our national or local jurisdictions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this talk. Now the presentation is open for discussion. Yes, Peter Harms.
Could I just ask raise a question about assent and consent?
Sure.
Because a very comprehensive presentation, thank you. But early on in your presentation, you suggested that assent is a bit of a sort of just a look towards ethical principles. But in fact, for clinicians and networks doing studies, assent is extremely important, because if a child is able to give consent, in other words, if they are competent to understand the intricacies of a particular study, they give their own consent. Mm-hmm. But if the parent, for example, if the child is of school age, 12, 13, if the parent doesn't give assent to the study, it's very unlikely they'll participate in it, because it may require missing school, being transported to the study center, etc., etc. There are very important practical issues. And likewise, if the child is unable to give informed consent, is not able to understand what is involved, the parent gives consent, but it is very good practice to get assent from the child as well, with the appropriate language and description that's within their understanding, because if they don't assent to the investigations, the frequency of visits, etc., it's not going to work either. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a very important issue. There is some confusion and difference of view on the meaning of these terms between those serving on ethics committees and clinical trialists actually doing studies and recruiting children. And I think it's a very important issue.
My point was that it was important, and what I didn't like was the belittling of assent to sort of be a whitewash used in situations where, at a minimum, for assent to be meaningful from the child, there has to be a minimum of understanding on the part of the child. Not the full understanding required for consent, but at a minimum, have the capacity to understand the nature, not all the rest, the futuristic projections and so on, that full consent of mature minors implies. Also, we have countries, and Quebec happens to be in this situation, where even if the child can assent, and even if it's a minor, age 16 or 14 or whatever, or 17, that the rule for research is that the parent has to consent, no matter the child's capacity. Where you would have already put that person in the consent category, we have to put them in the assent category, because legally speaking, only the parents can consent. So my point was that assent is really important, but that we shouldn't take away the fact that there is a minimum of capacity required on behalf of the child to be fully involved and for the assent to be meaningful, because if you can assent, legally speaking, ethically speaking, you can dissent, and it should be respected. So to respect a dissent from, normally walk in a hospital and run away, is that a dissent? So you can see why it's important.
So how would you feel is the best way to assess whether a child is capable of doing that or not? You used an example of 2 to 5-year-olds not having the capability to understand a trial, but I don't think it's as simple as putting a specific actual age on that. And I also still think that it's important to try your best as an investigator to try and incorporate the child's opinions of that trial anyway.
Totally agree. I think it's a case by case. I would not understand any country putting a numerical age on Ascent. Yeah, no, it has to be an ad hoc interpretation. Depends on the nature of the research, depends on is the child a child with chronic conditions, is the child a healthy, in quotes, volunteer, and so on and so on. And yeah, definitely. And usually it's either the research nurse or the investigator. But investigators are often, unless they're clinician investigators, and even so, who is best trained to communicate? I think that is the issue in terms of the child understanding and responding, and I don't think we should worry that much about categories, but rather the capacity for communication of the person involved.
Just a comment and then a question. For Ascent, I mean, one of the things that I always felt was unfortunate is the fact that there is no definition, if you will, of Ascent, at least in the U.S. regulations. And I go back to the work of the National Commission in an article that Bill Bartholomew wrote on Ascent, where he talked about bringing the child to an understanding of why they're being asked to participate. So they need to understand their condition and then something about the research. And then what they're going to experience, and then just have the ability to say yes.
Or no.
Which for a 5-year-old for a blood test might be possible, a 2-year-old I don't think would be. But a 5-year-old for a drug trial likely would not. So, I mean, it does require some understanding. I want to go back to your comment about research versus clinical. And my question is whether or not there's specific legislation that would forbid the application of clinical consent law to research. The reason I bring that up is at least in the United States, the FDA's position is permissive, which means if your attorney in your local jurisdiction is willing to apply the consent laws for treatment to research, then we will allow that to happen. Because if you look back at the National Commission's discussion about the definition of a child, they clearly applied consent law in the treatment setting to consent law in the research setting. So I guess I'm curious.
Yeah, no, you're totally right on.
Okay.
In the absence of a specific legal requirement distinguishing consent, a legal age of consent, from a legal age for clinical care, often without parents knowing, as you know, then what's normally used is either the age of medical care, because there's nothing said about research, or what's used, if there isn't a statutory age for medical care, we use what's called the mature minor rule, which is, again, an ad hoc determination based on each individual child's level of maturity. Yeah.
Yeah, just one more question or maybe a remark on the ability of children to understand the information and the age. We're not very good, I think, in offering the kind of information which is convenient to very young children. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I started treating children with HIV/AIDS, we used a cartoon set which was developed by colleagues in Belgium to introduce as part of a compliance kind of program, and also to make sure that the children understood the disease. And it's amazing how much you can do even with children of 4, 5 and 6 years old. The other issue is that as long as we still offer written information, and that written information has not been checked according to, say, the wording which would be convenient for an IQ of, say, 80 or so, but we use words which are only understandable if you're having an IQ of 100 or above, we will fail. So it's also a question of looking for innovative approaches to inform very young children, and in that way we can contribute a lot to better understanding of these children.
Yeah, and I think to take your point one step further, it's not because they're not capable of assent, i.e. A level of understanding where it would be meaningful in terms of their being able to dissent as well, that the means of communication for even younger children should also be adapted. Likewise, I totally agree. Yeah.
Thank you. And now we get a time for the last question. Professor Hasford, you ask for.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting presentations, and I can agree with most of it, but I have a couple of comments. First of all, you asked for more transparency when a research application is rejected. I think at least in Germany it's customary that before you reject an application that you have a face-to-face discussion with the applicant.
Accepted as well, not just rejected.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. But in a certain way, I think when we discuss informed consent or assent of children, we should first try to get some homework done for adults. There are a couple of studies in the literature showing that we, with informed consent procedures, we achieve from a legal point of view perhaps, or formal legal point of view perhaps, we achieve that the patients provide informed consent. But if you ask the patients directly after the procedure or a week afterwards, considerable proportions of the patients who have provided informed consent did not understand essential parts of the trial design about randomization, the type of treatment they receive, and. And therefore, I think we have to focus much more and to try to develop our informed consent procedures definitely much more before we think about having that with children. I do know that this cannot be sequential, but I have to raise that point. And I think the ethics committees are up to now very liberal that they accept the current provisions, which are insufficient according to the literature. Another point in this respect, in this direction, is that you can, or you will meet many physicians who tell you, if I really want a patient to participate in a trial, he or she will do it, I can do that, as I can convince them to provide informed consent. And again, it's an issue in my experience, and I have, as a trialist, quite an extensive experience. Even investigators quite often do not understand all the implications of running a trial double-blind. So how do you want to explain that to adult laypersons? Not to speak about children. From a researcher point of view, as I said, I think many things are absolutely correct. But from an ethical point of view, I think the current situation is not really comfortable.
Two comments. I mean, the literature on that particular point on adults not understanding has been 25 years of showing just as much, just when you, and I'm a lawyer, I'm supposed to read a lot of this stuff, but when you go in and you buy something, do you accept the conditions or on, your computer and whatever? That is a problem. But the problem is not solved by what I call the notarization of informed consent. And that is increasingly lengthy, boilerplate, the hold harmless and indemnify. I'm supposed to know that. I went to law school. I mean, I'm trying to think, how is that problem solved by having I've seen 27 pages of consent forms. I mean, I wouldn't even read it unless I had a client and I had to protect them. But so your point is taken is not only that they cannot recollect. How are we doing this? And maybe it comes back to your innovative forms of communication to children. Maybe we need comic books for adults because we're certainly not achieving a true communication in the informed consent process by papers with clauses that make lawyers feel, safe. Put it that way. Yeah.